In 1979, Mad Max transformed empty highways into a savage prophecy and turned its cast into icons overnight. But by 2026, time didn't just pass, it cut deep. Behind the fame came divorce, illness, disappearance, and hard survival far from the spotlight. What really happened after the engine stopped and the cameras went dark? Join us as we uncover their real lives and honor the legacies they left behind. Mel Gibson as Max Rokitansky. Mel Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, United States. At 23 years old, he played Max Rokitansky, the haunted highway patrol officer in Mad Max. The character's silence, grief, and controlled violence anchored the film, turning a gritty Australian production into a global shockwave. That controlled exterior was shaped early. As a teenager, Gibson was uprooted when his family moved from the U.S. to Australia, forcing him to adapt fast and suppress instability in order to survive socially and academically. This internal pressure followed him into acting school and later into demanding roles like Gallipoli and The Year of Living Dangerously. Success deepened the cracks instead of sealing them. Gibson married Robin Moore in 1980, building a large family while his career exploded through Lethal Weapon and later Braveheart. But constant absence, power imbalance, and fame slowly eroded that marriage, ending in a divorce that exposed long-contained tensions and stripped away the private life he had carefully protected. Once that structure collapsed, his personal struggles became public. A volatile relationship with Oksana Grigorieva, combined with alcoholism and emotional instability, erupted into legal battles and scandals that echoed the desperation seen in films like The Beaver. Hollywood distanced itself, and Gibson's career stalled. Today, Mel Gibson is 70 years old and still active, working mainly behind the camera after rebuilding trust through projects such as Hacksaw Ridge. With an estimated net worth of around $425 million, his life reads as a cycle of rise, collapse, and survival, proof that even icons forged in chaos never truly escape it. Hugh Keays-Byrne as Toe Cutter. Hugh Keays-Byrne was born on May 18, 1947, in Srinagar, India. At 32 years old, he played Toe Cutter, the sadistic biker gang leader in Mad Max. His raw unpredictability injected fear into every scene, giving the film an antagonist who felt genuinely unhinged. That instability reflected a life without permanence. Growing up between India and England due to his father's military postings, Keays-Byrne learned early that security was temporary. When he turned to theater and later joined the Royal Shakespeare Company, structure became survival, eventually leading him to Australia and into films like Stone and The Man from Hong Kong. Fame never insulated him from strain. Married to Christina Keays-Byrne, he lived quietly, choosing artistic credibility over celebrity while navigating financial uncertainty common to character actors. Television and genre work, including Farscape, kept him visible, but always on the margins of mainstream recognition. Age and illness later narrowed his world. Heart-related health problems followed him even as he returned powerfully as Immortan Joe in Mad Max, Fury Road, a role that reframed his earlier chaos into authoritarian menace. The performance felt final, as if the franchise itself was closing a long open wound. Sadly, Hugh Keays-Byrne died on December 2, 2020, at 73 years old in New South Wales due to health complications. He was buried at Palmdale Lawn Cemetery after a private memorial focused on remembrance rather than spectacle. With an estimated net worth of about $5 million, he left behind not excess, but impact, proof that some legacies linger because they disturb, not because they shine. Steve Bisley as Jim Goose Rains. Steve Bisley was born on December 26, 1951, in Lake Munmorah, New South Wales, Australia. At 27 years old, he played Jim Goose Rains, the loyal highway patrol officer and Max's closest friend in Mad Max. Goose's brutal fate gave the film its emotional rupture, turning Max's job into a personal war. That loss on screen echoed a tougher road off it. Bisley grew up on a small rural farm where work came early and ambition had little room to breathe. Leaving home as a teenager to survive in Sydney, he carried that pressure into acting school. This tension later visible in raw performances such as The Chain Reaction and The Big Steal. As his career stabilized, his private life became more fragile. He shared 4 children with longtime partner Sheila Florence, but the relationship eventually collapsed under emotional and financial strain. A later marriage to Sally Burley ended even more painfully, culminating in a highly publicized assault conviction that permanently altered how the public viewed him. Those years marked a turning point rather than an end. Bisley avoided self-destruction by leaning back into work, committing himself to long-running television roles like Water Rats and Doctor. Physical injuries from action work lingered, but it was reputational damage that proved harder to heal. Now, Steve Bisley is 74 years old and still active in acting and writing, choosing steady craft over celebrity. With an estimated net worth of around $3 million, his story feels quietly tragic. A man who helped ignite a legend, paid deeply in his personal life, and kept going anyway. Scarred, but present. Joanne Samuel as Jessie Rockatansky. Joanne Samuel was born on August 5, 1957, in Camperdown, New South Wales, Australia. At 22 years old, she played Jessie Rockatansky, Max's wife and the fragile center of his family life in Mad Max. Her warmth grounded the violence, making the film's later brutality feel personal rather than abstract. That emotional clarity was earned early. Samuel pursued dance and drama from a young age despite resistance from a traditional family that feared instability in the arts. Breaking into television first, she learned discipline quickly, carrying that control into later projects like Allison's Birthday and Nightmaster, where vulnerability remained her strongest weapon. Marriage brought stability, but not immunity from loss. Samuel built a quiet life with her husband, balancing career and motherhood, yet the early death of her son left a permanent mark. Grief reshaped her priorities, pushing her away from constant acting and toward work that allowed meaning rather than exposure, including Hey Dad, and later mentoring roles. Health would test her again. Samuel was diagnosed with bowel cancer, a moment that forced her to confront mortality without spectacle. She chose treatment close to home in Australia, supported by family, even declining offers of help from powerful friends, a decision that reflected her lifelong refusal to dramatize pain. Today, Joanne Samuel is 69 years old and remains active as an actress, director, and teacher, shaping younger performers through theater education. With an estimated net worth of around $2 million, her legacy is quietly devastating. She gave Mad Max its heart, lost much of her own, and spent the rest of her life passing strength forward rather than chasing the spotlight. Roger Ward as Fifi McCaffey. Roger Ward was born on July 24, 1937, in Adelaide, South Australia. At 43 years old, he played Fifi McCaffey, the hard-edged police commander and Max's superior in Mad Max. The role gave the film its last line of institutional order, a calm authority standing on the brink of collapse. That authority was forged early. Ward grew up during and just after World War II in a working-class household where money was scarce and survival came first. Forced to work young, he learned endurance rather than ambition, a mindset that later fed naturally into rough, physical roles in films like Stone and The Man from Hong Kong, where toughness mattered more than polish. As his career expanded, stability never followed. Ward married and divorced multiple times, and each breakdown carried a financial cost that steadily eroded what his long resume should have secured. While he continued appearing in television and cult films such as Turkey Shoot and Quigley Down Under, personal life remained unsettled, marked by repetition rather than repair. Age brought wear instead of rest. Years of doing his own stunts left lingering physical strain, narrowing the kinds of roles he could accept, even as his reputation as a dependable character actor endured. Later projects became smaller and quieter, but they kept him working, even when visibility faded. Today, Roger Ward is 90 years old, occasionally involved in minor film projects and industry appearances. With an estimated net worth of around $1 million, his story feels sobering. A man who held the line on screen, paid heavily off it, and aged without the safety net his contribution deserved. Tim Burns as Johnny the Boy. Tim Burns was born in 1953 in Canberra, Australian Capital Territory, Australia. At 26 years old, he played Johnny the Boy, the unhinged gang member spiraling toward inevitable punishment in Mad Max. His jittery recklessness injected unpredictability into the film, making violence feel impulsive rather than planned. That instability had roots. Burns grew up amid family separation and emotional tension, learning early that control was temporary and anger traveled fast. Acting became an outlet, and those raw instincts later surfaced again in projects like Resistance and Spotswood, where restlessness defined his presence more than dialogue. Career momentum never fully solidified. Burns worked steadily but quietly, never escaping the shadow of Mad Max, even as he transitioned behind the camera as a cinematographer. The lack of consistent recognition placed strain on his personal life, contributing to a marriage that eventually ended in divorce and emotional exhaustion. Today, Tim Burns is 73 years old, living largely outside public attention while remaining connected to film through occasional projects. With an estimated net worth of around $800,000, his story is quietly painful. A man who helped define chaos on screen, then spent a lifetime learning how to live without it. Jeff Perry as Bubba Zanetti. Jeff Perry was born in 1953 in Australia. At 26 years old, he played Bubba Zanetti, the cold, calculating lieutenant of the biker gang in Mad Max. His icy stare and controlled brutality gave the gang hierarchy credibility, helping turn the film's violence into something structured and frighteningly believable. That restraint was shaped far from cinema. Perry grew up in rural Australia, where opportunity was limited and survival depended on discipline rather than dreams. That grounding later surfaced not only in Mad Max, but also in historical drama such as Gallipoli, where quiet endurance mattered more than grand speeches. As work arrived, pressure followed. Perry maintained a stable marriage, but the stop-start nature of acting created long absences and financial uncertainty, slowly testing domestic balance. While contemporaries chased constant visibility through television, he appeared selectively in projects like 1,000 Skies, choosing control over exposure. Career momentum never exploded, but it didn't vanish either. After Mad Max and Gallipoli, Perry continued with smaller film and television roles before gradually stepping away as the industry shifted toward younger faces. The transition provided security, yet also marked a quiet withdrawal from a world that once hinted at something larger. Now, Jeff Perry is 73 years old, living largely outside the spotlight. With an estimated net worth of around $1.5 million, his story remains restrained and unresolved. A man who embodied menace on screen, then chose disappearance over decay. Vincent Gil as Knight Rider. Vincent Gil was born on March 13, 1939, in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. At 40 years old, he played Knight Rider, the screaming, self-destructive outlaw in Mad Max. His opening monologue detonated the film, announcing chaos as the new law of the road. That volatility echoed his upbringing. Growing up in Australia during the long shadow of World War II, Gil absorbed an atmosphere of instability and fear that never fully lifted. Acting became release, and early work in biker films like Stone allowed him to channel aggression into performance rather than silence. Success, however, came unevenly. Gil worked relentlessly across television, theater, and film, appearing in series such as Homicide and Prisoner, yet financial security remained fragile. A painful divorce deepened emotional strain, pushing him into non-stop work that blurred the line between passion and survival. Later years brought a heavier burden. Diagnosed with cancer, Gil continued acting despite declining health, taking roles whenever strength allowed, including late career appearances that kept him connected to the craft. The illness narrowed his world, but it did not extinguish his commitment. Sadly, Vincent Gil died on August 21, 2022, at 83 years old, in Australia after battling cancer. He was laid to rest privately, without spectacle. With an estimated net worth of around $500,000, his legacy is haunting. A man who opened Mad Max with a scream and spent the rest of his life carrying its echo. Sheila Florence as May Swayze. Sheila Florence was born on July 24, 1916 in St. Kilda, Melbourne, Australia. At 63 years old, she played May Swayze, the sharp-tongued, battle-worn farm owner in Mad Max. Her brief but piercing presence anchored the film emotionally, the same way she later would in roles that demanded lived-in pain rather than glamour, such as Prisoner. That gravity was earned early. Growing up during the Great Depression, Florence left school at 15 and entered adulthood while survival still outweighed dreams. Scarcity and responsibility shaped her long before fame, feeding a resilience that later carried her through decades of theater work and early screen roles like Bellbird and The Devil's Playground. Marriage brought love, then devastation. She wed Roger Lightfoot Oyston in her teens, only to lose him in World War II, a loss that left her widowed with children and emotional scars that never fully healed. Her second marriage to Jan Adam Ballawhiter offered stability, yet illness returned when she became his caregiver until his death in 1983, even as she continued working on demanding projects like Prisoner and Handle with Care. Illness would finally turn inward. Diagnosed with lung cancer, Florence refused to retreat, completing her final film A Woman's Tale, written specifically for her as she faced death herself. The performance, quiet, unsparing, and painfully intimate, earned her the AFI Award for Best Actress, announced only days before she died. Finally, Sheila Florence died on October 12, 1991, at 75 years old, in Melbourne from cancer. She was mourned in a packed church that rose in a standing ovation, a farewell rarely granted to working actors. With an estimated net worth of around $300,000, her legacy rests not in wealth, but in endurance. A woman who carried sorrow onto the screen and never softened it for comfort. Bertrand Cadart as Clunk. Bertrand Cadart was born on April 30, 1948 in Amiens, France. At 31 years old, he played Clunk, the hulking, mostly silent enforcer of the biker gang in Mad Max. His physical menace added weight to the gang, complementing louder characters by proving that fear could exist without dialogue, much like in later appearances tied to the Mad Max legacy. That presence was forged through upheaval. Cadart emigrated to Australia as a child, growing up between cultures where strength often spoke louder than words. Those early pressures shaped a physical confidence that translated naturally on screen, later echoed in documentary appearances and retrospective projects like Beyond the Wasteland. Acting, however, was never his only path. After Mad Max, Cadart stepped away from regular screen work, channeling his drive into the motorcycle industry and later into public service, including a term as mayor in Tasmania. While he returned briefly for projects such as Bolivian Kiss, the shift created distance at home, and his marriage eventually ended under the strain of constant reinvention. Health would ultimately halt that momentum. Diagnosed with cancer, Cadart withdrew from public life, enduring treatment away from cameras and crowds. Even then, he remained connected to the Mad Max community through interviews and legacy features, confronting mortality with the same quiet resolve he brought to Clunk. Sadly, Bertrand Cadart died on April 10, 2020, at 71 years old, in Caloundra, Queensland, after battling cancer. He was laid to rest privately, far from the noise of his most famous role. With an estimated net worth of around $700,000, his story closes with restraint. A man who embodied brute force on screen, then chose a life where strength meant endurance, not spectacle. Paul Johnstone as Kundalini. Paul Johnstone was born on September 26, 1953, in Australia. At 26 years old, he played Kundalini, the wiry, unpredictable member of the biker gang in Mad Max. His jittery presence and sharp physical timing added instability to the gang's dynamic, complementing louder figures and reinforcing the film's sense of barely contained chaos. That nervous energy did not appear by accident. Johnstone grew up in a household where expectations around school and performance were constant, creating a quiet, internal pressure rather than open conflict. Acting became an outlet during his youth, first through smaller stage and screen opportunities, later surfacing in early projects like Listen to the Lion. When Mad Max unexpectedly became a cult landmark, it briefly placed Johnstone inside a rising wave. He followed with appearances in films such as Running on Empty, working alongside stronger ensemble casts, but he struggled to secure momentum in an industry that increasingly favored either leading men or long-term television regulars. Instead of forcing longevity at any cost, Johnstone gradually receded from the spotlight. Sporadic acting work gave way to long stretches of privacy, while contemporaries remained visible through serial television or stage revivals. The choice preserved personal balance, but it also meant his name faded quietly from public memory. Sadly, Paul Johnstone died on February 22, 2023, at 69 years old in Australia. His passing drew little media attention, fitting the low-profile life he had chosen. With an estimated net worth of around $400,000, his story remains understated. A man who helped define a legendary world, then stepped away before it could consume him. David Bracks as Mudguts. David Bracks was born in 1949 in Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. At 30 years old, he played Mudguts, the aggressive, impulsive biker in Mad Max. His raw physicality intensified the gang's threat, making violence feel sudden and personal rather than choreographed. That aggression was rooted in a difficult urban upbringing. Growing up amid economic pressure and crowded city life, Bracks learned early to defend space and identity. Those instincts translated naturally into acting, later visible in films like The Coca-Cola Kid, where roughness and humor collided, and in other Australian productions that leaned on realism rather than polish. As steady work arrived, personal stability remained elusive. Bracks married and later divorced, a period that overlapped with uneven career rhythms and financial strain. To maintain continuity, he expanded beyond acting into assistant directing, balancing screen roles with behind-the-camera responsibilities on projects such as Crocodile Dundee 2 and other large-scale productions. That shift reshaped his career. While acting became intermittent, technical and logistical work kept him anchored in the industry, offering security at the cost of recognition. The transition mirrored a broader acceptance. Visibility mattered less than survival, and craft outweighed fame. Today, David Bracks is 77 years old, living a quiet life loosely connected to film production. With an estimated net worth of around $600,000, his journey feels grounded and worn. A man who embodied uncontrolled violence on screen, then spent decades learning how to manage it off-camera. John Lay as Charlie. John Lay was born in 1951 in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. At 28 years old, he played Charlie, one of the rough-edged locals circling the violent world of the highways in Mad Max. Though not a central figure, his presence thickened the atmosphere of menace, helping the wasteland feel crowded with danger rather than empty. His early life unfolded under the long psychological shadow left by post-war Australia. Raised in a society still shaped by conflict and austerity, Lay grew up surrounded by stories of loss and survival that quietly hardened his worldview. Acting became a practical outlet, leading him into Australian film and television through steady work rather than sudden breaks, including later appearances in Turkey Shoot and Neighbours. That working-class trajectory carried into adulthood. Leigh married, but personal life proved fragile as financial instability and irregular acting work placed strain on relationships. Emotional distance widened over time, and loss became a recurring theme, echoing the grim fatalism that defined many of his on-screen roles. Health eventually replaced hardship as his main battle. Diagnosed with cancer, Leigh withdrew from public life while continuing to take small roles when possible, choosing dignity over exposure. Finally, John Leigh died on December 16, 2020, at 69 years old, in Australia after battling cancer. He was laid to rest quietly, without public tribute. With an estimated net worth of around $200,000, his legacy is modest but sincere, a familiar face in a legendary film who lived and exited without illusion. Steve Millichamp as Roop. Steve Millichamp was born on October 31, 1956, in Australia. At 22 years old, he played Roop, one of Max's fellow officers, young, eager, and visibly unprepared for what the roads would become in Mad Max. His vulnerability contrasted sharply with the brutality around him, reinforcing the sense that innocence had no place in this world. Millichamp's formative years were shaped by discipline rather than chaos. Drawn early to performance, he trained through theater before transitioning into film, where physical presence mattered as much as dialogue. That grounding later carried into suspense-driven projects like Road Games, where tension relied on restraint rather than spectacle. Unlike many co-stars, his career leaned heavily toward stage work. While he appeared in films and television, including Turkey Shoot and later crime dramas, Millichamp remained committed to theater, where consistency offered creative control but limited financial reward. In later years, Millichamp's visibility declined as illness restricted both stage and screen work. Sadly, Steve Millichamp died on November 8, 2013, at 57 years old in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. He was buried without fanfare, remembered primarily by colleagues and theater audiences. With an estimated net worth of around $300,000, his story feels understated and fragile, a young face in Mad Max who never outran the limits of a hard, uncelebrated career. More than 4 decades after Mad Max, the road has taken its toll. Some of the cast vanished quietly, some endured loss and illness, and others survived long enough to watch the world change around them. So when you look back at Mad Max, 1979, all cast, then and now 2026, which story shocked you the most, and which one still haunts you? Leave your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more untold cast journeys, and stay with us as we uncover what time did to Legends of the Wasteland.